Right, for those who don't know me, my name's Ray Summers, and welcome to this meeting of 39. And you've all come along to not listen to me, but to listen to the person who's going to speak to us, Bob Hoskins. And I guess most people in the room, somewhere along the line, have met Bob, had dealings with Bob, and they've assured me they've all made the last instalment on their carpets. I made some inquiries as to Bob's history. I met Bob very early in life when we used to be visiting Pentridge Jail, but that's it. But what I did find out about Bob was, and this is brief, been a member of the Chamber of Commerce in Blackburn Village Christmas Fair, been involved with that, member of the Rotary Club of Nunawading, been in that 49 years, and he was the last one of the charter members. Yes, still.
That was.
President of Rotary Exchange Student Program since 1980, and what's even more special about today, he's bought one of their old Rotarian that stayed.
Leave it to me.
So I guess there are many. Yep, and Bob will explain. And good to have you on board, Christina.
Thank you.
What else? Involved with Blackburn Football Club for over 50 years. Involved in the centenary celebrations of Blackburn in 2001. And I put here, and in his spare time, proprietor of Hoskins Furniture Store, later Hoskins Carpet Gallery. I don't think I need to say any more. Thank you, Bob, for coming.
Right.
You'd like to tell us about it, and then we'll open it up for some questions, or you want questions as you go?
I'd rather at the end.
Righto.
All right, thank you for the introduction. Just to make it clear, my name is actually Robert Marshall C. Hoskins, and younger generations will think that's a different person. And a few years ago, a couple of years ago, I was in the paper or something, and my name in the paper was Robert Marshall C. Hoskins. And would you believe the neighbour just over the road asked me was I any relation, or did I know Robert Marshall C. Hoskins. So the name Bob, of course, is stuck with me, and most people of my generation, I was born on 4th of November in 1935 in the Ballarat Base Hospital, so I'm 78, and most of my generation, if they were christened Robert, they are called Bob. The latter generation, that's of course not the case. The same with William, became Bill, but that's a bit beside the point of why I'm here. Christina came to our place yesterday after exactly 30 years. She was a Swedish and still lives in Sweden, exchange student to the Rotary Club of Nunawading. Bev and I were her counsellors when she came, and she stayed for 1 year in Australia, and she came in yesterday, and then she found out I was going to make this little address this afternoon, and she thought she'd like to just come along and hear, I suppose, about Blackburn, and so that's the reason she's come. So welcome, Christina.
Thank you.
And I'm sure all these people are welcome you too.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
Okay. Now, when Ray asked me to do this, I haven't done one of these for a while, but I must admit I got very worried about it. I thought, oh heavens, you know, my memory's 78 years old, my memory's fading, and I've got to talk about things that can't happen 60 years ago when I came. I was getting worried about it. Anyhow, I went up to the doctors. I gave the Blackburn Clinic and I said to Dr. Lavis, look, I've got to do a talk in a couple of days, and I'm worried about it that my memory's not going to be good enough because it is fading. I find that I can start a conversation and I get halfway through the conversation and I forget what we started talking about. He said, how long's that been going on for?
I know the feeling.
I said, how long's what been going on for? So you're in trouble today. Okay, well now, Blackburn, like me, many of you live in this nice, leafy, cosy, law-abiding, which it is, low crime suburb, and we probably think we're middle class nowadays in this suburb, and we probably think we're in the upper echelon of society. Might surprise you though, Blackburn is named after a convict. And this all starts, we go back to 1833. A gentleman named James Blackburn in England was sentenced for fraud, and he was sentenced as a convict to Van Diemen's Land, and he came out as a convict, but he was a very educated man. He was an engineer and also a surveyor, and so obviously an architect. So obviously he was a valuable convict. He wasn't a labourer convict. They used his skills to build the bridges. Those of you who have gone to Tasmania, you can see some of those bridges that were built back in the 1850s by convicts, and you marvel how they did it. Well, he would have taken a fair bit of part of the actual designing and the supervising of those sort of things for roads and so forth. So he was a very valuable convict. And I think because of that, in 1841 he was granted a pardon. And I don't know whether he was granted a pardon because they later reviewed his case and found him not guilty, or whether just they were so pleased with his contribution to Van Diemen's Land that he was given a pardon from that reason. He stayed there and he worked for the government on the various sort of projects that I've just explained. And then in 1849 he then moved to Melbourne, or in the meantime he'd married and had a family, and he moved to Melbourne. And he teamed up with another gentleman whose name I'll just better check. His name was Hodgkinson, I'm trying to think of his first name, Clement Hodgkinson. He teamed up with him, and they are credited as being the founders of Melbourne Water. So it seems that probably using his engineering skills, surveying skills, that they probably contributed greatly to the first water storage, and maybe the pipeline. He must have been a busy man, because in 1850 he and Clement Hodgkinson were given the role of surveying most of this area. So he came out to Blackburn at 1850. Now, if you can imagine when he came here, I suppose most of you at some time have been up to Blackburn Lake, have you? Have you been to Blackburn Lake? And you've actually been in and walked around the lake edge and the bushland that's there. It's fairly scrubby, some tall trees. That's exactly how the whole of this area would have been, the whole of Blackburn. There are no nice grassy patches or anything. Where we're standing would have been just the same as what it would be if you went up and stood in Blackburn Lake. So that's how the land was, and they surveyed it with the view to be able to, of course, government to sell the land to various people that wanted to settle. So that was the reason that he was here, and he surveyed this land. The land at that time, so you can imagine, also was not productive as far as the indigenous people were concerned, because there was a few minor creeks ran through it that would run dry in the summertime and just leave stagnant water in water holes. There wouldn't have been a lot of animal life to actually feed off, wallabies perhaps. It was too bushy for kangaroos. So there wouldn't have been a lot of indigenous activity here, probably a few tracks through. So when we get to that point, then settlers did start to move out of Melbourne, and there must have been a big influx of settlers came in from overseas, because in many countries, and I know England particularly and other countries, if you lived there, the hope of ever owning land at that time would have been just virtually none, because you'd never be able to say, look, the landowners own large tracts of land. But if you can imagine you came out to Australia and all this land on the east coast was going to be available, so it was quite attractive for a lot of immigrants to come. And the people started then to come out here and clear land and settle land, and there was a track that went up between our called White Horse Road, and that was a track which led up to, down to, firstly to Warrandyte, because the first gold strike, of course, in Victoria was at Warrandyte, and that track went down White Horse Road at that time, followed Anderson's Creek Road as we know it now, to Warrandyte, and it went around, came up again up about Churnside Park now, and then went on to Healesville. Would have only just been a mere track. That attracted a number of settlers, only a very few, came out and started clearing the land. And their source of income was firewood, because everything relied on for heat and furnaces. Firewood was the only form of energy. Couldn't switch on your gas heat or electric light. So there was quite a demand in towards the centre of Melbourne for firewood. And that's how those that came out and took up land started clearing it, and they sold it by going in by a wagon, which would have been an arduous journey, and would take the firewood in by wagon, and they would sell it in the more Melbourne area. In 1861 though, that was, I'd say, the first development, and 20 acres was sold, and the Travellers' Rest Hotel was built, exactly where the Blackburn Hotel is today. And that was built because at the same time the Cobb & Co coaches started to come out and take their journey, as I said, around by Warrandyte and go on as far as Healesville. It was a regular drive. And Blackburn was the first stopping point, so that's where they would stop to either rest or change the horses. And while they were doing that, if you were a passenger in the Cobb & Co coach, you were able to go in and the hotel and have hopefully a cool drink. If you're a lady though, and it was a hot day, you either remained sitting in the hot coach or you got out stood under a tree, because women weren't allowed into hotels in those days. You know, don't want to take up a sexist position, but that's how that was in those days. So Cobb & Co coach, Travellers' Rest, that was really the start of establishing Blackburn. There was then at least a couple of traders that started along the Whitehorse Road a bit further along. We can't tell exactly where they were, but there was a blacksmith and a sort of general store. They would have just been no more than shacks. But that, they were a couple of traders that also started anyhow, that was all. A lot of that legacy was Thomas Morton. The other thing about that he had with the idea with his model towns, and you'd all be aware of this, he didn't just want square grid-logged streets. So if you look at, you've got Central Road, you've got Gordon Crescent, you've got Wolseley Crescent, Wellington Avenue, Jeffrey Street, they're all nicely curved. And that wasn't just by luck, that was by design, because he wanted not a straight street, and he wanted them to have that curve on them. And a lot of people, obviously around the 1900s, were attracted to the model town, and there were some quite nice houses built. And if you go along Gordon Crescent today, you'll see not only Max Whittick's house, which was Thomas Morton's, you'll see others further along that were built around about 1900. And in Wolseley Crescent, there's number 5, it's built, I know it's built in 1898. It's a nice Hawthorn brick house with a slate roof. Right next door to that was McCubbin's, the painter of the Heidelberg fame. He lived next door, but unfortunately his house has been demolished. But they came in around that time because they were attracted to the township. But in the early 1900s there was a financial crash and the land development company went broke. So the land there the administrator had to sell the land, blocks of land. So what did Thomas Morton do? He did what most entrepreneurs do. Once one thing goes under, they look for something else. He became a real estate agent and got the job of selling the blocks of land that he designed in the first place. So he had an office down in Surrey Hills, and he actually then for some years sold the various land in Blackburn. So Blackburn started to then develop more because of that, and I'll just show you. There's a couple of photographs, you can have a look at them after. They are Blackburn around 1900. The one here on my right is of the railway line. That's taken from the south side looking north. And there you can see there is an old car in that, and it's one of those really, really old things that used to have to be around about 1902. And what I'm looking at here, that's also, if you were standing where the roundabout is and you're looking over the stage, over the railway line and looking south. So there are a couple there. I've got a couple of others here a bit later. Oh no, there's this.
A couple outside too.
This one here, so this one here is down, if you go down Blackburn Road to, where there's a bridge where it does cross the creek, and that's looking down there, which you can see at that stage, there's no houses, it's all just trees, there's no, obviously nobody's built anything down there. Oh yeah, that's joined as well, but and there's also one there, people playing tennis at the tennis courts, and in that one you can see the men playing in full length black trousers and a shirt and a normal man's hat, not a tennis hat. That's a bit of Blackburn in the early 1900s. The shops started to appear probably more like 1920, and if you were, probably a lot of you know where Pryor's Hardware was. There's a group of shops there, they were built in the late 1920s, so there was enough business coming into Blackburn from Eastfield and Doncaster that generated enough people to be able to trade there. There's Pryor's Hardware I mentioned, and next there was his brother, had the butchers, who was a real estate agent. And then some of them started here on South Parade, particularly between Gardenia Street and Blackburn Road. And there's a building there, if you look up, it's got 1928 on the parapet. So they were sort of all built in around that area, and they're going down into more the area between Gardenia and Main Street. There was one building there which I think everybody at the time knew about, which was Raftus's. And Raftus's, if you don't know, was a hay and corn store, which were common around Melbourne in those days, and they sold wheat and hay and corn for horses and wheat for chooks. And they had a weighbridge, and if you went there, you would drive in. It was quite a wide block, and you had entrance with quite. One of them had died. But Bob Raftus was still there when I came here, and he would be a shorter man than me and skinnier than me. And at that time, I would be about 20, and I wouldn't be able to pick up a full bag of wheat to save myself. And he would just go like this and grab the two ears and go, put it on his shoulder, "Where's your car, lady?" and take them out. And of course, he died of a heart attack, no wonder, but it was a remarkable business, a real icon sort of business in Blackburn was Raftus's, and it's where Barry plants are today. So that happened, and it was gradually sort of building up, and then everything stopped because the Second World War arrived, and there was no building materials available, and there was no manpower to do it anyway because most of the manpower was involved in the war. So virtually nothing much happened then for a few years in Blackburn. No houses to speak of were built, no commercial things were built either. So we then sort of moved into the era straight after the war. And after the war, we had the era, I suppose, then of a lot of baby boomers. And by early 1950s, I'd liken Blackburn then to Narrewarren today. We're all first home buyers. And the orchards were being subdivided. The orchards were up at, if you take Surrey Road up to Goodwin Street, that was all orchards. They were all cleared. Further down in Springfield Road, people called Lawford had a very big area of orchard there, including where Blackburn High School is today. And they were rapidly being cleared for subdivision. There weren't any orchards on the south side of the line because the land had already been subdivided back in 1890 by the Blackburn Land Development Company. So there wasn't any orchards, but then there was a lot over the other side of Canterbury Road. And these were rapidly cleared. Now, developers bought them, And if you're a developer in those days and you went along and you bought the orchard, and all you had to do was get a road grader and grade the road a bit, grade the dirt, form it into a bit of a road, a bit of a hump, and you got a few loads of gravel and spread on it, and you got a water pipe to run down alongside it so people get water, and you've got the SEC to put power poles and the electricity. And that's all you had to do, and you could then sell the land. So it was rapidly sold, and a lot of builders came out, just single builders, some of quality and some of doubtful quality, and they built a lot of weatherboard houses, particularly in the areas I just mentioned. And you could buy, if you're a first home buyer, you could buy a weatherboard house, a 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom house, which had nothing in it at all. Maybe it had a stove but nothing else. But the price of that in, say, Maple Street or off Lake Road and further, the price of a 2-bedroom one is £3,500, that's $7,000. If you want a 3-bedroom one, it's £4,000, $8,000. Now, if I go and tell my grandkids that you could buy a house and land package in Blackburn for $7,000, $8,000 either, that you could have bought that in Blackburn, they would say, oh, poor old Bobby, he's losing it now. He's probably means $80,000. $80,000. But that was the case. That was the going price. And so lots of people came. The roads then soon degenerated because the winter time they got wet, and if you lived any distance on those roads, you had to wear a pair of gumboots to walk out of them, and you'd probably have to try and change them when you got onto the asphalt near the station. So they became quagmires, and there was lots of problems with them. And I can say later on when we were started that we had a furniture van, mid-sized furniture van, and I can honestly say I had to get towed out of Maple Street twice when it was bogged in the middle of the street. And you go down here, so it was bogged there in the middle of where you're looking now. And again, I wouldn't believe it. Same with Lake Road, bogged out, or taken, had to be towed out of there. Later on, of course, I think it would be around about early 1960, government brought in the regulation that if you were going to subdivide, you had to form the road, you put curbing in, and of course the sewerage was on the way then, so it made it very different. But in those days, it didn't matter. The people flocked in and took up those housing, and the families grew because they were people that either had come back from the war, if they might have been married before the war, and they started a family. And then if you were, say, 1930, you were born, you were too young to go to the war, but you were 20 in 1950, so you were perhaps looking to get married and other families. It wasn't long before Blackburn Primary School had the highest pupil rate, or pupil enrolment in the whole state at 850. And later on, of course, Blackburn High had 1,800 and something, and that was the highest. But you can imagine then all these young families and this infrastructure that hadn't kept up. But that's how it was up to what I'm talking about, up to the early 1950s. Now, that's where I come in. Now, we moved to Blackburn in 1953, but in 1954, early 1954, and I won't do a talk about my business and the evolution because that would take me another half an hour, so we won't go into that too much. But I came in because Dad, by accident actually, came down to have a look where our shop is, if you're familiar. Hoskins Carpet Gallery now was Hoskins Furniture. South Parade was 2 vacant blocks of land on one title, and there wasn't much else, which I'll show you in a moment. And he, it was up for auction. He had no intention of buying it, but he bowled at the bowling club, and the auctioneer was a gentleman named Matt Hoth, and my Dad regularly bowled with him. He said to another, oh, we're going to go down and have a look at that. See how Matt Hoth goes in that auction this afternoon. And And so off he told. When he came home, because that time we just lived in Blackburn Road, when he came home, the conversation was, my mother said, "Oh, how did that auction go, John?" He said, "Oh, I thought that land went pretty cheap." And she said, "Oh, how much did it sell for?" He said, "It sold for £1,350. She said, "Oh, that sounds a good buy. I wonder who bought it." He said, "I know who bought it." She said, "Who?" She said, "Me." She said, "Whatever for? What do you do that for?" He said, "Oh, well," he said, "I thought it's a developing shopping centre. I thought I might hold on to it for a little while and perhaps subdivide it into 2 blocks and then sell them separately, and I might make a bit of capital gain." Now, without going any further, that didn't happen. But so, you know, on that aspect, as I say, I could talk for half an hour on what happened with it's just about the business. But I did get your help, right? When you did this diagram, pretty rough and ready diagram, but what I'll just explain to you, if you can just hold that up. When we came, that's us, that's Hoskins. And that's when we built that, so that's a new, that indicates it's a new building or recent building. So that was us, and that next door was also a hardware store, a double store, which now is divided into 2 shops. But that was just being built at the same time as us. There was a milk bar there that had been built a couple of years before. But all of this rest, all of this green, the rest of it, was all vacant land. So you can see in South Parade, these were just vacant. I put that as vacant land, but there was an RSL building set back on it, which was demolished pretty quick. Vacant land there, all of the vacant land up with the Caltex service station, those shops are there. That was just vacant land. That was vacant land over where the service station is now not operating, over on the other side. If you go over the railway line, I'm in your way, I'm sure. So you can see, what I was going to say, the green areas, you see, were all just vacant shop sites. You go over the railway line, and the first one next to the line was vacant land. There was shops there, more vacant land on the corner, all over in the railway road, vacant land, vacant land, vacant land. There. The blue is, there was existing shops. And where I put a red cross on them, those shops have since been demolished and replaced with other buildings. So that's how we found it. And over on the railway side, road side, where there's all those offices, they were just houses that were there. So that's how it started. Now, the change has occurred. By 1960, all of those areas there that are green had been developed into shops, and we had 7 butchers, and 3 over here, 4 here, 1 there, and we had 5 greengrocers. Today we've got no butchers, 1 greengrocer. We did have a supermarket here, which I'll explain later, a supermarket called Anstey's, and that's of course gone and become a bottle shop. So the change there between what it was when we arrived in 1954 is enormous. And I'll now just come back around to this side. And what happened, 2 shops were built there, and they had very successful. One of them now is the Maths 4 education shop. And then this one here has been divided in half, and there's a men's hairdresser and a shoe shop. But when that opened, I think that was land value. And then when you get here, where I get here, on the corner, which is, corner of Main Street, that was developed as a shop, and it opened as a fruit shop. And then next door to that was a butcher, I'm trying to read what I've got there, and then there's the fish shop, which still remains today. That was a butcher there. And then that was vacant land for many years. And then you see menswear shop there, and then where this is, of course that was Rafters's. And Rafters's, no, Swabbers I think, Rafters's was the paint and corn store I mentioned, and that's now, one half of it is now a Subway, and half of it is Barry Clan. And this vacant land here, that also became the butcher at the time, which is gone, and it's now a florist shop, and then on the corner where the real estate agent Stockholm Lego over today, and that's got shops that come divided right back. So this changed. That's where the Commonwealth Bank, I should have said, is, and that's where the butcher was. That was demolished. And this supermarket that was up here, news agent's still there, and that's at Anstey's, which is a supermarket. And Anstey's, you can put it, just balance it there. Anstey's, he opened the supermarket in around about 1957, and he was, I believe, to be the first actual supermarket in Melbourne, where you actually, the others, see, there were 4 grocers, but the other grocers were over-the-counter grocers, and you went in and you said, look, I'd like a pound of sugar and a packet of Wheaties, and you got it off the back shelf and down there and put it on the table and asked you, did you want it delivered or you going to take it, and they were all over-the-counter grocers. One was on the corner of Blackburn Road and South Parade, on the corner where that shop has just been refurbished and has become Gerald's Craig. That was another over-the-counter grocery, and there's one on the north side. But Anstey started as an over-the-counter, but he turned it into a supermarket. And it was so busy that he would advertise, if you remember, there was the Melbourne Herald, there's a Sun Herald today, but the Herald in the afternoon. And he would take a page in the Herald just for his one shop, and that'd be on a Wednesday. And on the Thursday, you would not be able to get a park anywhere near his shop in the street. And people would come for this cheap tea or whatever it was he was advertising. And I remember talking to a lady one day, and I said, well, where do you come from? And she came from Moorabbin, and had a great big car. I said, what have you over here for? And she said, oh, I've come over for the cheap whatever it was. And I thought, you'd burn 3 times as much value in petrol than what you'd save. But nevertheless, he just attracted, he was a magnet. He attracted all these customers. Great entrepreneur. But unfortunately, he later on, the business suffered. I think no relations of NCD. No? He got a liquor license, and he got the liquor license, and in brief, he became an alcoholic himself, and a fairly severe one at that. And the business suffered, and he actually left the business. There was other owners came in, and one owner I think was quite good, but with most businesses, once they change hands, they're sure sooner or later to get an owner that's not up to scratch, and the business dies, and that's what virtually happened in the end with a very poor ownership, because a lot of people go into retail that should never be in retail, and they just don't have that customer rapport, and that's what happened there. So Anstey's was an interesting one, but all of the others I mentioned, with the exception, we're the longest single family owned, without change of ownership business left, but the chemist shop has remained exactly where it is, and the paper shop has remained exactly where it is. We're on the other side of the line where it's Jet Set Tours and the French cake shop, and we came in 1954, that was a service station, and the Bowsers were actually on the curb at the footpath. And you remember that was one of the few of the ones, but you went for petrol and you pulled up in front of what's now the French bakery, and somebody came out and served you with fuel, and you went in through some open doors and drove your car in for mechanical repairs. And that was a fellow named Eddie Peck, and he would have closed that down about 1956, and he built where J&J service station is today on the triangular corner, and shifted over to there, which is much bigger and much better service station. But they were some of the various things that have made a dramatic change. Now, Blackburn now, there's not a lot of big shops, as I mentioned, there's no butchers left. There's no menswear, there was quite a lot of in there, people sell ladies' wear, dresses. All of those are gone, and they're probably gone in most shopping centres, because today, I don't think you can make money in a small shop unless you sell food, because you just can't get the turnover compared to the very big places that you find in shops that you find in supermarkets. So, but that's the reason you walk down South Parade and across and you find lots of coffee shops and not much in the way of big shops. And as I said, that's because the only shops you can really make money, a cup of coffee, it only costs you 50 cents to make it, and you sell it for $3.80. So if you sell enough of those, you can make a profit. Same with other food, fish and chips. So that's my story about the history of Blackburn, the early history of how we got up to the 1950s and where we are today. So I hope that haven't bored you.
Are there any questions?
No, just a comment. As far as Anstey's was concerned, he was among the first to sell out of the cardboard box too. He didn't have very much in the way of shelves. He used to put the cardboard box full of
It was true self-service.
Take the front off it, and that was it. Yeah.
It was a true self-service.
It certainly was.
Yeah, did they close?
I'm not sure. See, it had a number of owners. I would have a guess and say mid-80s. The last owner was a very poor businessman. And I'd say the previous owner to him. The previous owner to them, John Marnie, was a very good businessman, and that was a very good business. And he'd come from a liquor trade background, and he was very good in promoting the liquor side of the business. It's just a pity John Marnie didn't stay on.
Were there many shops open in the early 30s during the Depression?
Yes, there was, and it's remarkable that some survived.
Oh.
In Blackburn Road, as I mentioned, a number of shops were built in the late 20s, and there was one particular store there was, which two brothers I mentioned, and Pryor's Hardware. And I've heard people say they don't know how he managed to keep his doors open, but somehow he did. And his brother with a butcher's shop, the same. But with the butcher shop, meat is probably less affected in a downturn because people still have to buy food. But that survived. When you come over to this side, the news agent, a chap named Bill Lowe in those days, he survived. And the chemist shop has had a number of owners, but that survived. And I think there were clothing stores that opened at that time. It would have been hard going, but because of the increasing population coming into the area, you'd probably start off, with a moderate turnover, but your turnover would keep increasing all the time. Whereas if you were probably in a settled area, you would not be able to increase your turnover. And so that would probably be the key. And the same with, I mentioned, the raftuses that had the hay and horse ornament. That was an essential thing because people did have chooks and they had cows and horses and needed all those things. So raftuses survived for that reason. I'm talking about that if I've been going. Have a minute. When they had orchards here, they used to have to, of course, take their fruit and they'd pick the fruit, and probably the husband and maybe his son or others would pick the fruit. The wife would have to pack them into a box, and the husband would, with his horse and cart, would take the fruit into the market. He'd come out off, probably have a couple of hours nap. About 11 o'clock at night, he would harness the horse, go off in the market, sell his fruit, and he'd then head home. And by the time, once he passed Camberwell, he would probably go to sleep on the thing because the horse knew the way home. And it was essentially he had to try and get some sleep. And I know of a case in there where, of course, if you're growing stone fruit, you don't go to market for 8 months and then you start going again. So I know a case where the cab wagon or the cart was parked in the shed, like for all that winter time, the 8 months. And so first time for the season they picked up some fruit. Off went the fellow with his horse and cart into market, and he got into about Richmond, and another orchardist caught up with him. He must have had a greater horsepower horse, I suppose, but he caught up and he said, "Hey, Norm," he said, you've got a row of chooks perched on your back axle. And they'd been roosting all the winter, and of course each set off in the middle of the night, and they were still there. He said, what are we going to do? Oh, with Pin and I'll try and catch them here, because they'll go everywhere. So we'll go into the market and we'll get a bag and catch them there.